Good afternoon. Nice to see you all. I've been looking forward to today's event for some time now. Last 2 weekends, devoted myself to rereading Moscow X, and it's a good thing I did because it's changed. And I was telling David, it's changed a great deal since the last time I read it. Maybe that's something we can talk about at the beginning of this. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Slick. I'm the director of the Intelligence Studies Project here at UT Austin. And on behalf of my colleagues from Strauss Center and the Clements Center, welcome to today's book talk on Moscow X. So between the centers, we host dozens of book talks on campus over the course of the year. And what makes this one so unusual and interesting in my view is that it's overtly devoted to a work of fiction. Now, I suspect we've actually hosted quite a few fiction writers here before, but that's usually not how they build their work. But this Moscow X, it says so on the cover, so I'm sure about that. And when you read it, you'll be struck by how closely the plot actually mirrors the daily news headlines that are coming out of Moscow and St. Petersburg. So I'm going to introduce you, or in some cases reintroduce you to David McCloskey. Some of you will have met him in the fall of 2021 when he spoke with us about his terrific first novel, Damascus Station. After his introduction, I've asked David to take a few minutes to set the stage for his second novel, Moscow X. Then I'll join him for a short conversation on several of the themes I found most interesting in Moscow X. We'll save time at the conclusion of the talk for you to ask David some questions. You can ask him about the book if you wish. You can ask him about today's Russia, not to be confused with Russia today. Probably may want to ask about that as well. The Middle East, where he specialized as an agency analyst, or his peripatetic career from intelligence analyst to business consultant and novelist. Right? So David's a fellow traveler for our long-suffering graduate policy students. He earned an MA at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He specialized there in energy policy and the Middle East. He landed a position as a Middle East analyst at the CIA, where he had the opportunity to write for the President's Daily Briefing, testify before Congress, but second time after that, and also brief senior policy meetings, as well as foreign leaders on the agency's analytic judgments. David also had the opportunity to serve and report to embassies in the Middle East, including during the so-called Arab Spring uprising early in the last decade. David ultimately left CIA for the McKinsey Business Consultants. Both Damascus Station, and Moscow X were well received by critics and the reading public. Damascus Station was a finalist for the 2022 International Thriller Writers Award for Best First Novel, and it's currently in development for television at Lionsgate Entertainment. So that's cool. And I'm waiting, as I mentioned at lunch, I'm waiting to see who plays the part of Artemis Aphrodite. Those of you who have already finished David's works and plan to read more, get used to that. That's one of the rich characters that David has a lot of fun with. So please welcome David.
All right. Can you hear me? I can also just speak up.
No,
all right. We're good. Okay. Well, Steve, thank you so much for that wonderfully kind introduction and reintroduction. This talk is already going a lot better than the last one I gave in Dallas, actually. And it's not just because of the kind introduction or the lunch we had beforehand, but it's because of this lectern here. So 2 weeks ago, I think, did a little book talk at a place in Dallas that normally doesn't host talks. And so I had to get there a little early to set the room up. And it was kind of almost a boardroom feel to it, where you had chairs had to be rearranged, a bunch of stuff. The furniture had to kind of be reworked. And so I had setting the thing up with a couple people there, and there's not a lectern. And I was going to speak for a more extended period of time. It kind of wasn't this type of conversation. So I'm looking for something to put some notes on, and there was like a stand over in the corner that had these rocks on it. They looked like rocks to me. It looked like something you might get at Bed Bath & Beyond. And so I lifted the rocks off the stand, dragged the stand over. I kind of put the rocks off by this fireplace. And the events coordinator came in the room about 5 minutes later and was pretty miffed at the way we rearranged things. And she's looking and she sees the empty stand that I've taken as a lectern. And she's like, oh my God, where are the dinosaur eggs? It turned out that pile of rocks was a 100-million-year-old fossilized dinosaur egg pile that was extremely valuable, and she was not amused by the stand being taken. So this is already off to a much better start. And I haven't rearranged anything here at LPJ School yet. So let me just say a few words about kind of the book and the journey from writing the first one to the second one, and then Steve and I'll have a conversation. So the title of this book is Moscow X, and you might be forgiven for assuming that I had intended all along to write a book set in and around Russia, because the first, maybe it was the second working title for this book was actually Comanche Station. And it was my attempt to write an entire spy novel set in Texas, which, as it turns out, is quite difficult to do. And I had defectors, Russian defectors in Plano and the Dallas-Fort Worth Burbs. I had a Terminex van that had been appropriated by a Russian wet work team as cover. I had this chase going from Dallas down to the Big Bend, and I wrote about 75 or so pages of that book. And I sent it to my editor, who is a very experienced editor and has never said a kind word to me about anything that I've written. And yeah, he called me back a few weeks later and said, you know, this is terrible and you shouldn't write this book. And so, of course, you know, as a writer, having written a first book and you're trying to create a second one, that sort of thus began a relatively dark period of my writing career and trying to come up with what in the world is this thing going to be about. And so I had two Russian characters in that book who had been in Texas, and I moved them. I did one afternoon of writing. I said, all right, I'm going to move them to Russia and sort of see how that works. And I literally took these, I transported them, and I started to kind of rework the story. And what sort of, you know, there's a chaotic kind of writing process, but then also geopolitics intervene as well. So I'm kind of working on the story. The first draft is done around the time of the sort of proper Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 22. And then I also was finishing edits in last June when I woke up and found that Yevgeny Prigozhin was maybe marching on Moscow, sort of supportive mutiny or coup, whatever you want to call it. So I had a very strange position for purely editorial reasons of waking up and really hoping that Vladimir Putin would prevail so I wouldn't have to write this book. Because I was done with it about that. But the story that really ended up emerging was centered on kind of one big question, which is what might it look like if the CIA, from a covert action standpoint, got really serious about sticking it to Vladimir Putin, to use a technical term. So the book is called Moscow X. It is a fictional component of the CIA's very real Russia House. And in the book, it's a group of people charged with taking what I call a very outside-the-box, aggressive approach to dealing with the Russians. The group is led by this case officer named Artemis Proctor, who, like all good case officers, has a little bit of a screw loose. And maybe her more so than others. Steve can check my memory on that. But she decides that she's going to run an operation in which she will make Vladimir Putin believe that a coup is underway when one is in fact not. So she finds two CIA case officers called NOx, officers under non-official cover, help run this operation. They get close to a Putin money man named Vadim, who's this very sort of despicable character, banker based in St. Petersburg. But he has a wife named Anna, who is a banker as well, but who's also an officer of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, and who is really kind of anything but what she seems. So the book, I really did try to, and I'm sure Steve and I will talk a little bit about this, update the tradecraft to a degree from the world of Damascus Station to deal with hopefully some more modern themes. But, you know, like all hopefully good spy novels, it's also attempting to deal with love and betrayal and loyalty and issues of identity. And really, I think, kind of what does vengeance and revenge look like amid the shadow war between Washington and Moscow? And so hopefully the story was all the better for having started in Texas. But I'm really excited to be here today and to be in conversation with Steve about the book. So thank you for having me.
All right, thanks, David. By the way, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I told you I spent the last 2 weekends with it. I enjoyed it. I liked it a lot. Not just the thriller aspect of it, it's a page turner, and I recommend it to people if you haven't read it yet. But also, I have a personal interest in some of these issues as well, because for a number of years, I got paid by the U.S. government to recruit and handle the Soviet and then Russian intelligence sources, and so I have a professional interest in this as well. So the first question I want to ask you, we touched on a little bit. And that's what a case officer would call mastering the operational environment, right? Sort of ready to effective, persuasive, engaging book on a topic like this. You have to know a little bit about what you're talking about, the culture, the politics, the personalities, some of the names and places involved. And that was easy enough for you in Damascus Station, right? You were one of the U.S. government's experts. You were the embassy out there. You understood Bashar al-Assad and the civil regime and the civil war that was going on and featured better than almost anybody in the government. So that's a given. This is Vladimir Putin's Russia. So tell me about the process. How do you, I imagine it's like threading the needle a little bit to the extent that you need to know just enough about the topic, the place you're writing about, so that you can bring along the novices. But you also don't want to embarrass yourself in front of your former peers back in Washington, the President Obama used to refer to it, right? Because they know you're a fraud to a certain extent, right? They know you really don't know your way around Russia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So how do you do this? How do you get smart?
Well, so it was a daunting task and honestly, that was a little bit of why I wanted to set the book to begin with in Texas, because I thought, I won't really have to deal with as much of that stuff if I
a foreign land you already understand.
Right, exactly. So as soon as I had moved it to Russia, I did that with a degree of trepidation to begin with, because I knew that it was going to involve an immense amount of research. And what I tried to do is early on in the process, have enough conversations with people who actually know things about the topic, plus reading as much as I can on it. And honestly, having conversations with people who, they might not even be, foreigners, they might not have worked Russia, but just talking with Russians, who had lived in Moscow and St. Petersburg. What's the weather like? What does it feel like? What do people eat? What are apartments like? What do people wear? There's a whole aspect of the world building here that's kind of mundane, but that if you don't, you can really miss if you don't get it right. And so I do all of that for a period. And then I really try to stop and just write and let the story kind of work. And then I'll come back and rinse and repeat that process, usually 3 or 4 times during the course of the book, because I'll get I'm experiencing this now in the book I'm writing. I know I'm over my skis on a number of different topics, and I've pushed it for the purposes of the storytelling. And then I try to go back and say, okay, where can I fix things so they're plausible and still work for the story? Or where do I need to explain in a clever way to the reader that I actually know the rules that I'm breaking, and I'm not just doing it out of ignorance. So it's sort of an iterative thing that happens 3 or 4 times over the course of writing books.
So you mentioned this as well. I'd like to follow up a little bit. You just described it as an iterative process. So you had some surprises during the course of writing this book. I think in the acknowledgments at the close of the epilogue, you refer to some of the challenges you faced. Maybe this was one of them. Well, Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine. A little more than 2 years ago. I know you were just through first
draft was just done.
First draft of the
bad
book.
Timing.
What do you do? Because now everything's changed. Now you have a different economy, you have a different set of regional politics, you have a different security regimen in place at home, you have protesters, you have suppression of free speech and protests against the war. And that's not part of your current narrative. And so what do you do? How do you deal with something that large and disruptive?
So I was fortunate in that the plot I had been working on at that point it wasn't directly piped into Russia-Ukraine. And so I didn't have to like throw huge portions of the book out. But the frustrating, somewhat insidious part of that rewrite was that I then had to go into every scene involving Russia or a Russian and think about whether, and I'm doing this like as the invasion is progressing in early 2022, knowing that my novel will not come out until the fall of 23. So it's a bit of trying to like hit a moving target, but I know I can't be so precise in what things are going to look like because I just won't know. So I have to cast enough reality over this that'll plausibly be right 18 months in the future. And, you know, I thought, well, it seems pretty logical that the war will still be going on, and that there will be a kind of more of an authoritarian crush inside Russia as a result. And so I just took scenes that happened in Moscow and St. Petersburg, or I took the thought process of, you know, elite Russians who would have some real sense of what's happening, and made sure that there was enough sprinkled through so that the reader doesn't feel like, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't even feel like Russia's at war. I knew that feeling had to permeate the book, and yet it couldn't be the focus. So I sort of, my editor actually at one point was like, I think there's a little too much of this in here. And so we found spots where that could kind of get scraped out. But it's hopefully layered in appropriately so that you as a reader understand the time period that we're in and the reality of kind of what's going on.
It works.
Okay,
Since I knew the timing that was underneath it, it's sort of a sport for me to follow pieces that you had added back into the narrative that reflected there was a war going on in Ukraine, and that the security situation was different throughout the same, throughout Russia in this case. Towards the close of the book, I know it was a conscious and intentional act on your part. You sort of expose the unseen villain, right, and introduce as a character Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Yeah.
Right. I think I probably asked you this question 2 years ago about Bashar al-Assad. What thought process went into the decision that we're going to make this guy a character? We're going to bring him in. We're going to introduce him. He's going to participate in this scene, rather than just having him as this spectator, looming above, obviously dominating a society like Russia.
Well, so the motivation I think started this way. It was Bashar al-Assad was a guy that I watched at the agency for a long time, and I don't like him. And I had wanted in Damascus Station to give him a near-death experience, and so I did that in fiction in the book for a long time, which honestly for me was quite satisfying. And I think with Putin it kind of started with this idea of, well, let's see what we can do to this guy. And honestly, as I was writing that scene, you know, I had spent a lot of time watching videos of him. How does he comport himself? How does he speak? I watched that Oliver Stone documentary, you know, God help me, that came out like 5 or 6 years ago, but he's got tons of access to Putin. So you kind of see Putin and how he interacts. And I thought that I wanted to show the guy who is at the center. You know, so much of this book is the story of Anna, who, without rooting anything, I think the book kind of doesn't start as her story, but sort of becomes it as it goes on. And try to figure out how is she going to navigate all these different competing demands on her personally and professionally to get out of this mess. And Putin really represents the system that in many respects is constraining her. And so I wanted her to actually come face to face with him, see him. And, you know, I did become fascinated as I wrote the book. And this is a generalization, but I think it is generally true, or there's something to it, that the sort of Russian view of freedom and agency is not, or in many cases, is not the same as ours. And so the character of Anna is one who is actually trying to get her victory, not by standing up and sort of declaring that the system must fall, or that, you know, all Russians should be free. But in this case, it's actually, there's a line in there where she says, you know, I stole from a thief, and I'm going to get away with it. And the scene with Putin was necessary to show that she's getting away with it, that they actually don't know what she did. And I wanted her to have that conversation with him when that knowledge becomes apparent.
Okay. Terrific. I just realized I forgot my copy of the book, and I have something earmarked here concerning Vladimir Putin that I wanted to ask about. Always the leadership development analyst. Right? This is what CIA does, and they try to get inside the skin of foreign leaders and inform our policymakers about what these people are thinking about, what they're likely to do. Let me see if I can find it here. Here it is. Okay, so tell me if you recognize this or if you still stand by this. She'd come to think of Putin as many things all at once, an all-powerful czar and the cheerless manager of an unruly system larger than himself, a despot and an issuer of vague, sometimes ignored guidance, a new public idol and private source of jokes and snickers. He was former KGB's second chief directorate, after all, a thug and not an artist like the foreign intelligence men around Papa. Like the rest of the country, she thought he's proud, he's insecure, he's aggressive and pitiable, strong and weak at the same time. He was everything and he was nothing. But sometimes you had to give a damn about it because he was the center of the Russian world, the Hozan.
Yeah, I still stand by that, I would say. I don't think I can back away from that at this point.
Well, I got convictions there. That's a pretty complicated character.
Yeah. I'm not even sure I fully understand it. I know I don't, but I think there is something about those things that you can, again, generalization, like you could paper that onto Russian, expansion from the 16th century onwards and say, well, it's an extreme amount of territorial aggression being driven in large part by this profound feeling of threat and weakness. And I think that is also, can be true of Putin, the man himself. So I would generally stand by those contradictions as reflecting something real about maybe the Russian condition. I don't know.
Those of you who speak Russian know that the term is the Ruskaya dusha, the Russian soul.
Yeah,
it grows from the land, blood and soil. Right? There's a lot of that in there.
Yeah. So
I want to change gears a little bit here, switch gears. Talk a little bit about kleptocracies, a specific kind of autocracy, I suppose, and following the money, which is what former deputy FBI director taught us in All the President's Men. If everybody remembers the scene in the parking garage, Mark Felt says to Bob Woodward, follow the money, right? And that's how the Watergate conspiracy comes down. So both of your novels actually sort of live in this substrata of security men, bankers, sycophants, who make an autocratic, kleptocratic regime like Russia, or like Syria for that matter, function in the face of Western sanctions, which is what we do with these people misbehaving. So are all these regimes the same in your mind, or are there different qualities and characteristics to the kleptocracy that keeps Bashar al-Assad on top of the heap in Damascus and keeps Vladimir Putin in control strongly or weakly in Russia?
I think there are enough similarities that I felt, I'm sure there would be distinctions and differences in different flavors of autocracy, but I was, pleasantly would be the wrong word to use here, but I felt at home as I got to know the Russian system better, because it did really reflect a lot of what I had seen in the Syrian system. And I think in that case, some of the things that translated over, one, which is very striking, is the sort of hub and spoke model of actually running institutions, particularly coercive institutions. So, we take, in our American mindset, much more open society, we tend to look at replication of function as being a sign of inefficiency in general. And in the Russian system, as in the Syrian system, it pays to have different security organizations around you that all kind of go into the leader at the hub, but that don't speak to one another and that are often explicitly in competition with one another. So, most of the, like Assad or Putin, I mean, these guys spend an inordinate amount of time, I think, believing that the threat comes from getting killed in their bed at night or someone showing up at the door, and all of a sudden the system is being, you're out. They're not worried as much about, I think, day to day for the popular uprisings. It's much more about people around me, the courtiers around me, are they going to conspire? So you have to structurally set these systems up to make that really, really challenging, which is part of the reason why in the novel I went with that as the threat, because if you have somebody, you have a group, a well-organized group who are inside these systems coming after you, that is deeply, deeply threatening.
You must have been jealous that Yevgeny Prigozhin came along and you didn't invent.
I honestly, I joked about it when I was talking, but I was deeply concerned when I woke up that day because we had, we were like going to print, and Putin's a character in this book, and I'm like, oh man, I mean, if this guy gets tossed, like, what am I going to do? But I think, I mean, the fact that he was unable to, I mean, it's unclear to me even now, like what he was really intending to do, but the fact that he was unable to kind of roust any kind of coherent group to participate with him, I think does show to some extent the strength of these systems. I mean, the leaders spend time proof-proofing them such that if you have one courtier like Prigozhin who decides to make a move on you, there's 10 other spokes out there who all have no idea what he's planning and who are bound to you, and so they're able to actually go and fight the one who's resisting. So to some degree, it shows the weakness of Putin's regime and the brittleness. On the other hand, it shows some of the strength and that they were able to withstand it.
I'm not sure we actually know the complete tick-tock at this point of what happened during those days, but I'm not sure that the other coercive instruments actually showed up.
No, yeah, a lot of them were
sick. He was on his way to Moscow,
yes,
and a lot of them called him sick that day, and he almost drove through the front gate.
Yes.
Which would have been a shock to the guy who set all this up.
That's right.
You're describing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, without betraying the actual operation that's at the core of David's narrative, it's very clever. You wouldn't be surprised to know it's probably not the first time that these same activities were discussed in the White House Situation Room, because we have a hard time as a government coming up with tools, ways to influence the conduct of people. Vladimir Putin, we pretty much sanctioned them out. And so to what extent was this sort of a prescription, a recommendation for U.S. policy? Sort of follow the money, the soft underbelly of what appears to be a hard resilient regime. It's actually these relationships around the leader.
So I would say from the standpoint of the right of the storytelling, I began and thought, what kind of story would be interesting to read? I definitely did not start from what should we do? And then when I injected this, character Artemis Proctor, who is a tad unhinged, I thought, well, this is a great kind of mashup of, this is exactly the kind of thing she would think about. And it would be so hard to pull off, potentially chaotic, destructive, all kinds. I mean, as we had conversations about this as I was writing it, I mean, the amount of hand-wringing from the lawyerly types, I think, would have been extreme, as you're putting a finding like this together. So it's not so much a recommendation as it was, I think, my desire for some good entertainment in the book, and to see, frankly, just what might it really, it was kind of this what if we decided to really get aggressive, and let's just kind of see what that looks like. But as I was writing it, there were a number of times where I felt like I sort of had to dial things down because the risk profile of this finding, I think, would have stretched to dozens and dozens of pages. Someone would have had it written out.
I'm not so sure I agree with you. The lawyers definitely would have been up out of their chairs, but as a policy matter, this doesn't strike me as unreasonable.
Well, that's good.
That's a view from the bleachers. So you mentioned earlier this breed of cat, this subspecies called case officers. So you were an analyst at the CIA.
That's right.
You resisted the temptation that Tom Clancy succumbed to with Jack Ryan, right, to make his action figure a CIA analyst.
As much as I wanted to live out my fantasies, I shelved it for some
So the action figures in this story and the one that came before it are CIA operations officers.
Yeah.
You seem to have them collectively on the couch. You're trying to figure out what makes these people tick, what's different about them. What were some of the qualities that you associate with CIA case officers that you tried to instill, maybe even exaggerate in some of the recurring characters in your story? Starting with Artemis Proctor.
Well, say I'm saying this now again with some trepidation because I'm sitting by one here. So I'm curious for how you grade them. I like to say I was an analyst, so I was not a case officer, but I do like to think that I was able to observe them in their natural habitat to some degree, and have done a lot of it in the context of writing these books. And I found, so when I was starting to write Damascus Station, I was intrigued with why relatively authentic depictions of the case officer role didn't seem very common in fiction, because it does tend in the kind of spy thriller space to be more like, you know, Jack Ryan, more action hero, more military thriller stuff, which is all well and good. It's just, you know, that's not true. It's not true. And so I thought, well, this kind of seems you were trying to spot, assess, develop,
recruit, terminate. This is the agent acquisition cycle for those of you who haven't completed the course yet.
So my midterm Thursday.
There you go. There you go. I'm just gonna get about a sheet. This is the cheat sheet here. I was like, that's fascinating, because you're finding somebody who has information, secrets that we as a government want, and you were trying to convince that person for different. I mean, everyone would have their own different motivations, but you're trying to find a way to get to that unique person and say, how about you commit treason? Really? And
as I tell my class, Jim, all that is never the right answer.
Is
the individual involved.
Yeah, and so that is and then you layer onto that relationship, you know, in many cases, some real amount of potentially affection or trust. There's manipulation, you know, going on all the time, and a view that really like kind of made potentially incomplete information about who is sitting across from whom, and what does someone really want, what do they believe, et cetera. And I thought this seems like a fascinating centerpiece for any novel, because you're dealing with people, you're dealing with women, you're dealing with drama around love and betrayal and all these, you know, themes. I want to work on that, and I have found that, and this might be why you reacted to the findings, that this seems reasonable. And me as an analyst, I'm like, oh, that seems risky, we wouldn't do it. I did find, you know, as I'm talking with case officers, it seems like some of the common themes would be, I mean, a pretty good assessment of relative risk and ability to read people, understand people, kind of intuit what somebody might want or what might get them to the next step. I did find, and this could be a small sample size, but that very bizarre hobbies, I would say, on the part of many case officers. Like one, and I feature this in the third book, actually, like an extremely encyclopedic knowledge of exotic fish and like aquariums, and I woodworking in one case, cards in another. So this is kind of like a fanatical hobbyism that seems to kind of travel with some of these folks. So I'm like, this is and I've also found, just in getting to know many different types of case officers, that they're all kind of characters. And so they're great for fiction, because a lot of the stuff that Proctor does or thinks or whatever are just things that I've heard people say or talk about as I'm spending time with them. And I'm like, that's crazy. That's a great line for a novel. You know, I'm gonna put that. So it's been fun to kind of, and honestly, as an analyst, you know, I'm exposed to that world, but I'm not really thinking about it in this way. And now as a writer, I'm thinking about it all the time when I'm spending time with case officers.
Thanks for that. I want to get back to the issue of hobbies, because there's some hobbies represented in this book. But what you said, describing some of the peculiar hobbies that operations officers are associated with, reminds me of James Jesus Angleton. Some of you recognize him, the famous head of counterintelligence at CIA that launched the monster plot and turned out to be an extremely disruptive, harmful figure for US intelligence for a long time until he was sacked, right? For being too peculiar, too bizarre. Orchids.
Orchids, yeah. And time flies.
He was a master fly fisherman,
Yeah.
dry fly fisherman all over the East Coast. And he had a greenhouse attached to his Arlington home, Glebe Road home, where he grew orchids.
Yeah, that's right.
Passion. And he was one of the strangest birds to ever hit US.
Yeah, there you go.
So I think you're on something. Speaking of expensive hobbies, so some of your characters have some hobbies. I made a partial list: fine wines, expensive cigars, Swiss cheeses, guns, watches, thoroughbred horses, alpine ski resorts. Now, I imagine some of these are your fascinations or fixations.
All these trips are tax deductible.
Yeah. How do you do this without going down the rabbit hole and never coming back out? How much time do you devote to learning what kind of cigar this guy smoked for a paragraph and a half?
It is, so in constructing the world of the novels, there is always this balance of when do you just say they smoked a cigar? When do you just say he has a handgun versus when do you actually describe it? And then in the more elaborate things in this plot, like the horse racing, thoroughbred horse breeding and dealing, like that is actually a pretty significant component of the story, for good or for ill. And I had to do an immense amount of research on that, including spending some significant time with a guy who used to run one of the Kentucky operations, because I didn't know anything about this world. And I felt like it would be a really interesting way to generate travel between my CIA NOCs and the Russians, going back and forth between different horse operations. And so I had to invest a tremendous amount of time.
You started at zero.
I started at zero.
You're not a horse person.
I started at zero. I'm not a horse person. I think I'd sat on a horse like twice. So I really had to go and kind of build that from the ground up. You know, on the cigar point, I did have a conversation once with my editor because, you know, when I'm coming at this story, which huge parts of it take place in Russia, you have a tendency as a writer, if you don't know something yourself, over describe, to go through laundry lists of stuff, to be like, this is what the curtains look like, and this was on the table. And my editor called me one day, and he's also an extremely profane man. And he said, you know, it's like, no one cares what the damn drapes look like. No one cares what the silk, you know, so he was just marking the stuff up. And after his tirade subsided, he was like, you know, you're doing this because you're showing us, the reader, your world building. You need to strip that down to a couple very specific luminous details that help the reader's imagination work, but aren't too much. And so I think there really is like a less is more mentality with a lot of this stuff. And I generally don't like it in books when you get this laundry list of like gear and guns and brands and all that. Like I kind of, my eyes glaze over. So it's a work in progress for me as a writer, but I've tried to make it so that I'm only giving you like the cigar example I can actually remember, because this is a really upscale Mexican horse breeding and dealing operation. And so I wanted a couple
He needs to smoke
hints of like
cigar.
what kind of, you know, I'm going to describe for you what this is, because this whole place is extra luxe.
Got it. I want to go back to something you said earlier. You talked about upgrading or modernizing the trade craft involved. I want to draw on that a little bit, because I did notice that you spent a great deal of time and energy in here focused on what I refer to as digital tradecraft.
Yeah.
Sort of the characters sweeping this, what we call digital dust, away from their identities, their travel, their communications with agents inside Russia, all this so that they can keep their activities secret from the Russian security services, who are paying a lot of attention to this sort of thing. How did you design the tradecraft, the way people travel, the way people use alias and different identities, the way people commuted with agents inside what we refer to as a denied area, a hostile tradecraft environment? And how do you translate that into the challenge that operations officers face today? This is a live problem. trying to recruit and handle agents inside Russia and other denied areas in a digital age where everybody's got electronics, everybody uses electronics, ubiquitous video surveillance, all these sorts of things. But you seem to have made a considered effort, it seems to be a successful one, to design your own tradecraft. The way that people could communicate, Russians not know what they're up to, yet still functioning in a digital age. They use technology, but weren't hamstrung by it.
Right. Well, it was a pretty significant challenge because in Damascus Station, you know, that whole plot takes place in kind of the early years of the Syrian civil war. So we're talking, you know, almost 15 years ago at this point, and we were living in a different world then, truly. And so it felt more like the kind of typical out of embassy operations, having a case officer who's under diplomatic cover, who's in Damascus and able to meet with Syrians, like that all felt very traditional and workable for something that's happening 15 years ago. In a story that's set in present day Russia, I had to think about, okay, well, how would the agents, like, what does this ubiquitous technical surveillance world that we all live in, what does it actually do to the tradecraft that agency officers have to practice? And I think, I mean, look, I'm obviously on the outside and was an analyst after all, but the agency is, I think, grappling with this now. What does this look like? You know, in a world where you've got everyone's got a phone, there are sensors everywhere. The data is easy to store and extremely cheap to store, and more powerful, oftentimes AI-powered algorithms are able to make sense of all this information. You know, it completely upends that traditional tradecraft. And so, honestly, part of my logic for having my two CIA case officers, CIA and Max, who are trying to go after these Russians or get to know them, to have them, they're not traditional, they're not working out of Moscow Station, you know, they're never, you know, one of them is a UK, South African, dual national, the other one's Mexican. That makes it a lot easier all of a sudden to be in Russia, interacting with Russians, spend time with Russians. It's why I wanted to go with the horse stuff, because all of a sudden you've got reasons to be out on horseback with somebody talking for extended periods of time, which would be almost inconceivable if my protagonist were a case officer in Moscow Station. So it felt like, and then on top of all of it, from a storytelling standpoint, it's like, how do I not belabor the tech stuff with the reader? Because that's not, my humble view would be that most people aren't coming to spy novels to get the ins and outs of how this or that COCOM system works. Like, you want to see the human relationships at play. And so there's a balance there, I think, to get the authenticity right, but also to kind of, in some cases, sprinkle a little pixie dust over the tech so we can just move past it and get to the meat of the human story.
But at the end of the day, these are not Americans, not operating under official cover.
Right.
These people get to be themselves.
That's right.
And that's their protection.
That's right. That's right.
Which is an expensive way to run espionage operations around the world if you're looking to take this model.
That's right. That's right. Hard to find the right people, and
they only get one operation.
You only, yeah.
And they're sent to retirement, at least from this one.
That's right. That's right. And it doesn't work out so well for them in this one. Or at least it's a mixed bag. But it does seem to me like some of those themes are where we must be going from the standpoint of human espionage, because you just how do you at scale steal secrets from Russians or work inside Russia in a world where, you know, our embassy in Moscow must be just a pittance of use.
And then we have smart and committed people working.
Right.
Last question before we turn it over to audience questions. This is a little bit wonky. I apologize, but you're obviously a very gifted writer, and you've written effectively in different content, right? In school, CIA's director of intelligence, at Kinsey consultancy, and now as a novelist, as a fiction writer. What have you learned along the way? Because we spend a great deal of time with our policy students trying to help them enhance their writing skills during the time they spend with us. Nothing in my experience could be more important than being an effective civil servant, public service official, and being able to write written communications to be able to communicate effectively. What did you learn along the way? What did you learn about writing? CIA, from the consultants business, school, anyway, what are your tips?
Also, I'd say that's a good question. Let me think of a few. So one would be, I think it almost always is the right answer. This would be true from writing PDBs to writing, stuff for CEOs at McKinsey to the novels. It's like so much of what we think is logical in our head, or that might work in our head, once you put it on paper, it actually really tests that proposition. You don't have to share it with anybody, but just writing it down clarifies the thinking. And so I tried, if I was writing a PDB, I would just try to just get it down on paper to see what works. You can have a conversation, you have conversations like this at our morning team meetings, and then you can sit down with it and be like, it actually doesn't work this way. The story that we thought worked doesn't. That was true of writing decks at McKinsey. That's true of the novels. I had an idea for my third novel that sounded like a great idea. And then I started to write it, and in practice, it's like, this doesn't really work. So I'm going to back off that and try something else. So getting it down on paper, I think there's tremendous value to that. The other thing I would say is, and this is true across all the three kind of places where I've written, because there really are, McKinsey and the agency were very similar kind of analytical writing. This one,
Very spare.
very
Writing
spare.
style, I
Yes.
find one of the most effective in government, but it's spare, it's no frills.
Yeah, exactly. And really, you're trying to excise voice to the extent it exists from, PDBs. Like, you don't want the voice of the analyst coming through. Right. And in novels, that is not what you want. So there's definitely some differences. But I would say that across all three of them, being oftentimes, I think less is more. It's harder to get to less that works than it is, it's the classic Twain quote of, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. I think that is really the precision of language and economy of the words matter. They matter in fiction and they matter in the writing that you do if you're writing a policy paper. And really, I ultimately think that good writing comes down to good editing. And so over editing things, I always think I try to do 10-ish drafts of my books. Being maniacal and obsessive about the editing process is the way to get the thing to the best possible form of itself.
I didn't pay him to say that. Multiple drafts, edit, it's never finished.
It's never finished. And I think you do have to, there is value with PDBs and there's value with novels of writing it, getting it to what you think is the best possible point, and then doing some combination, probably both, of sharing it with the right group of people. Doesn't have to be massive, but getting other outsider, getting an outside perspective on it, and also letting stuff sit if you can. It's harder with a PDB, but letting stuff sit for a period of time and then coming back to it. I've often, I've found probably more so with the novels, but I think it would probably work if you wrote a policy paper and let yourself sit on it for 2 or 3 days and then come back. You will engage with the material in a different way, and it's almost always for the better.
It's really nice. Okay, the floor is open. We'd like to ask Steve a question. Anybody non-list? Yes, sir.
So thanks very much, Stephen Siegel, professor here at Slavic in Eurasian Studies and the Ukraine expert, one of them. I'm really interested in your interpretation of Russian history and, let's say, Russian events. So you mentioned the word coup-proofing, and I follow this really interesting sort of way of framing particular events in the history of autocracy, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism to think about internal plots. I think one of the great Russian events is the Streltsy coup, let's say, if we think about it all the way back into the age of the late 17th century, early 18th century, Peter the Great. When you think about Catherine the Great and her palace coup, what are some of the differences, let's say, in this 21st century system and Putin's particular system, since you mentioned the intelligence agencies competing with each other and almost coup-proofing against each other, if we can describe it that way? Like, what is this particular 2022, 3, 4 model of government that you see? Is there a historical precedent for it in the way that you fictionalize it, or is it something completely different? And I noticed we didn't use the F word, which is one way of describing the contemporary Putinist group. Thanks.
So I do think that, I mean, look, I couldn't compare it to a previous Russian system. I approached my Russia research as a humble novelist, not a historian or analyst, but I will say that I do think it bears many similarities with other authoritarian systems. I mean, it's not, again, it's not so dissimilar from the Syrian context in the way that it's organized institutionally, in the way that courtiers are sort of managed, in how centralized power is, and how much of what we see as sort of policy type stuff actually boils down to disputes over turf and personality. I think the centrality of money in this context is really typical. I mean, it was very similar in Assad Syria, but like the whole Putin system was consolidated around, you know, the early 2000s as they sort of took these strategic cash flows and assets that had gotten fragmented in the Yeltsin years and put them back together. I do think one, I mean, again, you know, this is very much up for debate, but I do think one piece that does differentiate kind of Russian autocracy is that I guess nobody thinks they live in a normal country. Everyone's country is exceptional, but I do think that there's something about the Russian view of this, like it's a special civilization. And as a result, its autocracy, and I think you see versions of this in the way that, you know, it would have been spoken about in, you know, I guess the late Romanov period, or maybe even earlier, of like, you know, autocracy, orthodoxy, there's a third component to it that I'm blanking on, but it's like the idea of a centralized system merged with this kind of almost religious messianism is something you don't necessarily see in other smaller autocracies. So in that sense, I think it could be, I don't know if it's unique in Russian history, but I think it is somewhat unique among autocracies today.
And yet you're comparing it to Assadism. So what is the comparison that you're making? Like, what is the biggest comparison to Assad?
Oh, I mean, I guess just general autocracy and the management of a system by a very small group of people to extract as much of the resources as possible,
okay,
and to limit, you know, sort of limit political life and to, I mean, I guess run it from a palace, right? I mean, there's a similar playbook, I think, between the two places in just the actual day-to-day management of autocratic politics.
Survive another day.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any questions? And we can, I haven't talked to David about it, but I know he still follows the Middle East closely. We'll probably be turning back there with future books, so we can take advantage of his expertise on matters Middle Eastern. Yes, sir.
What's your assessment of the impact of the killing of bombing? Here's your personal assessment. How do you think this is going to affect any of the internal politics?
I don't think so. Again, this is fundamentally unknowable, but it seems to me like, I mean, you've seen more openness because, you know, I think Putin and the people around them let it be the case that there, you know, there's an actual funeral, or there's actually people who came out and it wasn't totally stifled. But I guess in watching kind of the arc of what opposition has looked like to Putin since the war started, and even going back, you know, 10 years or so, like you just don't, it's hard for me to imagine how you get a kind of people power type movement that's based on anti-corruption, personal dignity. I mean, some things, I mean, really noble things. I mean, how do you organize that in the Russian context, I mean, I don't know. I just don't see it. And I think it's one of the reasons why, at least to me, it seems so tragic and so kind of dark with him having been killed. It's just that like he's already in, penal colony. His movement, will of course live on to some degree, but how it could sort of organize itself to really be a potent force against Putin, I just don't see it.
Thank you.
You've obviously held many different roles over the course of your career. So what drew you to write fiction, and how did you decide that novels were the best mediums to explore the themes that you wanted to discuss?
Well, it was more fun to make stuff up with the audience.
And to confirm,
because
you weren't doing that.
I would have done that at ADPs, maybe a little bit on the McKinsey PowerPoints. Just a little bit though. So when I left the agency, I had spent pretty much my entire time working on Syria, and I was frustrated with the way the policy was going, but I was also just sort of deeply impacted by the tragedy of the war. I mean, the whole country was shattered, and I sat down because I had a period of time leaving the agency and starting the next gig. I sat down and I actually just started writing, and I'm not precisely sure why I did that, but I was working through what I had lived and experienced. And it started as kind of like almost journal entry type things. Like I wasn't setting out to write a spy novel. I wasn't saying, look, I'm gonna go and try to write fiction. But I just started to write. And what I found was I could sit down and do that, and like 6, 7, 8 hours would just like go by like that. And for me, I think really the process of trying to do this for my career was because I really like that feeling. And so I enjoy getting in flow like that. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's really special. And so just the whole thing is like, how do I get back to doing that? And how can I do that for my career? It's, there are plenty of times in the writing season where it gets pretty grisly and miserable, but that feeling always brings me back to the knowledge of why I wanted to write.
Was there a sense of wanting to share with a broader audience or a different audience some of what you'd seen, the horrors of the Civil War, barrel bombings, and just horrible things that you didn't feel you got out of reporting them in secret channels back in Washington, or preparing a briefing, or performing some particularly prescient assessment or something like this? Was this a way to tell this story to a different group of people that might not have know about it?
I don't think it started that way, because I didn't really share it with anybody. I mean, my wife had to like pull it out of me to even read it.
It's therapeutic.
Yeah, it was really for me. And I took that whole thing that I wrote, because I wrote for like 3 months after I left the agency, and I printed it out at one point, and I literally put it in like a drawer somewhere and forgot about it. I didn't forget about it, but just left it there for 5 years. But I remember that feeling that I'd had. And so when I came back and had the chance to actually spend time writing, I did get to that point where I said, all right, I'm going to try to write something that I want to write, because I remembered that feeling, but it's also got to be something that someone else wants to read. And that thing I had initially worked on was really terrible. You need a plot to write a spy novel, and I didn't have that. But no, it never started as I want to tell people what I saw.
Yes, sir, in the back.
I mentioned earlier, you have a background also in energy and then Middle East. So I'm kind of curious, like we're lost on Tessa. I'm looking out 20, 50 years. If we have oil kind of reduces the share of global energy, kind of on a geopolitical, kind of what's your vision about this threat to the Middle East and these autocracies where elites are fighting over shrinking pies? And then a second question is kind of who's your influences as people you read, fiction or nonfiction?
So on the first question, I don't have a tremendously thoughtful answer for you, other than I do think, with petroleum, oil, et cetera, being a global marketplace, like I think that, you know, if you're a family in Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Bahrain, you're sitting on top of an ocean of hydrocarbons, you know, the future doesn't look totally bleak for you. So I mean that's my answer there. On the writing front, I read a ton of spy fiction. Really kind of all over the place between, I love, you know, the work of Don Le Carre, I love the work of Charles McCary, love the work of Len Deighton. I love more, you know, they're not realistic, but I really do enjoy a lot of the kind of shoot 'em up stuff. So, you know, Mark Graney, Jack Carr, Daniel Silva, all that kind of stuff. I love that. But then I do try to read outside of the genre too, and that's a fun process as well. We crime fiction, see how, you know, and how does someone put together like a mystery story? How do you deal with character, plot, setting, all this kind of stuff if you're not just writing stories about spies? So I try to mix it up a bit too.
Good chance to just want to do that.
I'm just very intrigued by the process of writing a novel. And I have in my head sitting down and like you would already have somehow the whole narrative planned out, like your whole story, and you'd have it strung around the wall in your room somewhere. And then you have to decide how to crunch it and present it. Could you just articulate that a little bit? And then how do you do that each day? What does your day look like when you're kind of unpacking that and getting on paper?
So I don't, some writers outline, I do not outline. I have absolutely no idea where the book is gonna go, which is why it's terrifying to write them, because every day you kind of wake up and wonder if you've run out of juice. But so some writers do. Some writers will, like you said, they will start and they'll say, this will happen, and they'll have a 10-page outline, and then the work of writing is sort of just filling that in, right? It's more than that, but it's kind of that. I don't do any of that. I write, I sit up, you know, I get up in the morning, I get the kids to school. I usually will try to write for at least 1 or 2 blocks of the day for 3 or 4 hours if I can. And I try to get to at least 2,000 words. That's the goal. And every day I try to write something that goes toward the book that I'm writing, but that it's like a scene that has some kind of energy to it. And so I will sometimes sit down. I did this yesterday when I was writing. I knew I needed to write a scene like this, but I had no idea where in the book it was going to go. And so I just said, you know, chapter X, start, and then just go and write it. And then I'll figure out where it goes later. Stuff gets rearranged all the time. I'm also extremely inefficient when it comes to the number of words in the book versus the number of words I wrote. So like the novels are somewhere between 115 and 130,000 words, and I'll write like 400,000 over the course of the book. And there is some logic there, which is like, if you're putting together, if you're a musical artist and you're putting together an album and that album's gonna have 14 tracks, I don't think you're just doing 14 tracks and then editing those. You're doing 30 to figure out what are the right 14 and how do they work together. And I found it similar. It is sort of a similar dynamic with the novel where I'll write a scene and it seems good. And then as I actually get to the end of the first, you know, horrible draft, which doesn't make any sense and has a whole bunch of plot holes in it you could drive a train through, and the characterization's not right, I'll look at what I've got there and I'll say, typically that first draft is like 150,000 words, 160,000 words. And then I'll edit it down to like 70. That'll stay. And I'll have notes of where stuff goes and I'll redo it. And yeah, I do that and every time you go, typically the cut gets a little finer. And so by the end, you're just tweaking stuff, but it's kind of 10 drafts of that, typically.
Can you imagine writing in the pre-word processing age?
No, I feel like my hands fall off. I don't know how. I don't know how people did that. How did people do that? I don't know.
Last question. Yeah.
Hi.
I grew up in a time where Russia was this kind of scary figure watching pop culture, Red Dawn, Rocky IV, and then just feeling very nervous. And I feel like there's a growing segment of the population that are like, let's vacay there, you know, or they see these kind of interviews and feel like Putin is not a scary figure. And so just your thoughts about that. And like the novel is set in Moscow, and there's just, it seems like a growing percentage of people not nervous or scared of this country and this figure.
For the record, my circle of friends are not vacation.
Look, I hope the book doesn't, I'm definitely not trying, because a number of the characters who are not villains in this book at all, they're Russian, right? Elites in the Russian system. I wouldn't want to villainize Russia or Russians by any stretch, but I do think, I don't know. I mean, look, it's a large autocratic country that, you know, in many respects defines its interests directly in opposition to our own. And so there's caution to be had when, you know, thinking about Russian power or in trying to, you know, resist it in certain parts of the world. I think it's important to look at it clearly. And I hope that in the book, I looked at it as clearly as I could. I mean, I will say this, that, you know, I didn't work on Russia at the agency. I worked on it to the extent that it overlapped with Syria. And so I had to, I guess I came at it with, some working assumptions, but really tried to kind of blank slate it a little bit to understand what does it look and feel like. And I will say it was hard, especially when dealing with the intelligence services, to paint a picture that was in any way rosy. You know, it got pretty dark pretty quickly when you're thinking about the work and operations of you know, sort of the Russian security services. So I think that's true. In the same time, it doesn't pay to kind of dehumanize or turn the entire population into villains. So I'm trying to walk some kind of balance.
I don't think I'm playing the clock to say there's some continuity in David's understanding of the Soviet Union and today's Russia. A brief interregnum in the Yeltsin years when the country was in turmoil, by their understanding, now it's been consolidated and returned to form largely, with the security honchos at the top of the heap, which is where they left in 1991. Thank you, David.
Thank you.